What do you mean by literary theory and criticism? To understand literary theory, let us first assume that you are reading the novel Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen. Now, while reading the novel, initially, we feel that the two central characters, Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, dislike each other. There is a certain hostility between the two. But later on, we see that, by the end of the book, both the characters grow fond of each other, and start respecting each other, and, finally get married. But this is just one interpretation of the novel. If you carefully look into the novel, we see that women are hardly given any social and economic stability in the entire narrative. The only stability that women are given is by marrying someone economically stable and with good social standing. We see that Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are always worried about their 5 daughters finding good match for them through the entire novel. We also notice how women are disinherited of their father's property, and it is a distant male relative who is eligible to receive all the property after the death of their father. We also noticed a stark difference between the way men and women are treated in society, and how the society is biased towards women when it comes to their rights. So, all these interpretations that we draw after carefully reading a novel like this are known as results of the close reading of a text. This close reading of a text leads to various other interpretations like marriage rights, property rights, economic freedom, lack of love and respect, or lack of mutual understanding between the characters. We also see that men, those who have money and good social reputation, are always having an advantage over the other men who are with no money. We see class discrimination between various people who come from different social classes. So this interpretation that we draw after carefully reading a book is called as critical analysis of a literary text, which is very different from a simple reading. All these interpretations depend on various factors, like the number of times that we read a book, or the time period when we are reading the book, what kind of readers we are, and what kind of background that we come from. Because, when we read a text, we try to understand that text in context of our own culture, our own social background, and our own understanding of the society. Now coming back to the term literary theory, it refers to various schools of thoughts that shape and affect our interpretation of a literary work. That means, it is up to our understanding of a literary text that makes us draw a conclusion or an understanding of a book. For example, our reading of the book Pride and Prejudice would make us feel that the book is raising the social issues like female liberty and female agency. To put it simply, literary theory is an essential tool which helps the readers not only to understand any literary work better, but also discover new meanings of a work, and to make it equally relevant and equally important in the present times. Without this critical understanding, we might take any literary work only on its face value, and we might not be able to understand its real purpose, which is to educate the readers and to make him or her understand any concerns and issues that the text is trying to raise. Literary theory began from the classical period, that is 8th century BC, when writers like Homer existed, and it extends up to the present age, that is the 21st century. There have been many theories that have come up during this time span, and with the help of all these theories, we try to understand the literature and interpret it according to our understanding of the world around us. Let us first discuss the classical theory. The classical literary theory started from the great classical thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, and Horace. These 3 thinkers are the founding fathers of the literary theory that we are trying to understand. Since we all know that poetry was the foremost genre through which the literature came into being, the classical writers wrote their ideas in poetic form, since prose was not into practice then. It was Plato who first gave the theory on poetry, where he criticized poetry and considered it as irrational and away from reality. He believed that poetry comes from inspiration and not out of knowledge. It does not represent any kind of reality or truth. It only increases one's imagination and seems to be pleasant to one's senses, but it has nothing to do with any kind of universal truth. He in fact suggested that poetry must be banned from society. But on the other hand, Aristotle, who was Plato's own student, believed that poetry was capable of representing the truth. He believed that poetry is the reflection of life. That means, it represents life as it is. He believed that poetry is the highest form of art, and since poetry is the representation of life, therefore poetry imitates life. He believed that poetry does not only entertain, but also gives a moral education to everyone. Horace also agreed with Aristotle in the concept of poetry as an imitation of life. He also believed that poetry not only imitates life and nature, but it also provides usefulness. He believed in the concept of poetry, which aimed at two things, delight and instruct, which means to give pleasure, as well as to give moral education. He even suggested to imitate great writers and try to seek inspiration from them in writing poetry. Next came the medieval theory. Unlike the classical theory, the medieval theory was deeply rooted in Christianity. Since it was the time when Christianity was spreading in Europe, and the biblical concept of birth, death and the resurrection of Christ were the major ideas prevalent during the medieval period in England, as well as the entire Europe. The major focus of the medieval theory was on understanding of the scriptures and interpreting the religious books like the New Testament or the Bible, to understand the concepts of God, birth, life, and death. Everything that the medieval theory pointed towards was related to the Christianity and the Christian religious myths. They believed in the concept given by Horace, which said that the purpose of poetry is to delight and instruct. So whatever literary compositions or poetry that was being written during the medieval period was majorly focused on praising the concept of Christ, the Savior, the only God, and most of the literature of this period is therefore deeply religious and didactic in nature. To understand this, we must go back and look at the kind of literature that was being written during the medieval time period. Next comes the Renaissance, or the 16th to 18th century criticism. The Renaissance modernized all of the Europe, and England in particular. The Renaissance came from Italy, and traveled to Europe. It was the time period when we see that the writers renewed their interest in the classics, like Homer and Aristotle, and the Latin classics, like Virgil. But we also see that the contemporary writers of England were also writing in their vernacular language, that is, English. This led to the growth of national literature during 16th century. So, there was a kind of debate between the ancient and the modern, which started from Italy and eventually spread through the Western Europe. The critics and writers who defended the ancients, or the classics, focused on classical genres like tragedy and epic, because, in the classical period, the poetry was written in epic form. For example, Odyssey, which was written in epic form, and tragedies like Oedipus Rex, written by classic tragedy writers like Sophocles. Those who favored the ancients also stressed on the use of Latin as the befitting language, whereas those who stressed the moderns favored the use of English language. Dryden and Pope were the two major writers who favored the classics, and they were well versed with the classic writers and followed their writing style. Whereas, poets like Philip Sidney preferred to write in the vernacular English, and produced the national literature written in the national language. But gradually, the focus shifted from classical to the vernacular, and from the ancient period to the present. Now, most of the critics as well as the poets started believing that they could do better than the classics if they write in their vernacular language instead of Latin language. So, we see a kind of nationalistic spirit rising during this period, that is the 16th to 18th century. The next period in literary theory and criticism was the Romantic period or the late 18th century. The Romantic literary theory and criticism evolved in the late 18th century, and it flourished during the early 19th century. It was majorly influenced by a French philosopher named Immanuel Kant, who laid emphasis on knowledge, which one can acquire only through experience. The Romantic literary criticism focused on the individual and his feelings and emotions. It was in direct contrast to the previous age or previous literary theory, which focused on tradition, intellect, and reason. For example, when we compare the poetry of Alexander Pope or Dryden with that of Wordsworth and Coleridge, we see that the focus of the neoclassics like Pope and Dryden was on writing poetry with perfection, whereas Wordsworth focused on poetry based on feelings and emotions. Therefore, Romantic literary theory was a departure from the previous literary theory in the neoclassical period. The major influence on the Romantic literary theory was that of the French Revolution, which talked of three things: liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French Revolution was based on the freedom of individual, not only from monarchy, but from any kind of oppression. It believed in equality for all, irrespective of their economic and social standing. In his book, Biographia Literaria, Coleridge says that a poet diffused a tone and spirit of unity that blends and fuses, each into each, by that synthetic and magical power to which we have exclusively appropriated the name of imagination. Coleridge basically meant that poetry is the outcome of imagination, and not an intellectual discourse. He believed that poetry comes from imagination, and it is not an art, which can be perfected through the study of the classic writers and imitating them to achieve greatness. Anyone with strong imagination can create poetry. The Romantic period saw two kinds of poetry: the lyrical poetry, like the poetry of Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats etc., and the epic poetry, like Byron's Don Juan, which is a long narrative poem about the life and adventures of the central character, Don Juan. But it was the lyrical poetry that majorly dominated the Romantic literary period. The Romantic literary period also saw the dominance of history in poetry, as well as novel. Because of the changing social, economic, and political circumstances around them, for example, the events like the French Revolution, the Romantic writers started to relate art and literature to historical periods. We see the reference of history in many of the novels written during this time period. Next comes the Marxism or the Marxist theory in the 19th century. The Marxist theory was given by Karl Marx, who was a German philosopher and an economist. The basis of Marxist theory lies in the fact that the society has different kinds of people and different kinds of social classes. One of the major components of Marxist theory is the conflict between the modes of production. In a capitalist mode of production, there is always a conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, that is the working class, and the owners. And in this conflict, the working class or the proletarian always wins. Karl Marx believed in the capitalist society, because he believed that it is only a capitalist society which can free the world from exploitation, class struggle, and inequality. Because, in such a society, everything belongs to the state and nothing is owned by any single individual, or the government. What is the Marxist structure of society as per Karl Marx? He believes that a society is divided into base and superstructure. The base consists of all the labor and all the means of production, that is machinery, factories, buildings, infrastructure, etc. Whereas, superstructure is everything that the culture has given to us, that is, the law and order, education, religion, politics, philosophy, etc. This superstructure is controlled by the rich and powerful upper class, that is the bourgeoisie. And since everything is controlled by this upper section of the society, so whatever the ideology this upper section believes in, is transferred automatically into the superstructure. And the base has to follow this dominant ideology. To make it simple, whatever a man with money and power believes in, and wants to achieve, it is gradually followed by the people controlled by him. He further tells us how this ideology operates in the society. To describe it, we have to understand the term hegemony. According to Louis Althusser, hegemony is the ideological state apparatus, wherein the majority of people are made to believe in certain rules and regulations by the ruling class, without the use of violence. And all this is achieved through constant conditioning which the majority people go through in their entire lifetime. For example, the church, or any religious place, makes us believe in the concept of God, and we believe in it without any question. The institutions like family and school make us believe in the concept of importance of marriage and education respectively, which seems very essential for an individual's overall social growth and development. All these ideological state apparatus are the ways of the ruling class to dominate the majority of the people and make them believing in the things as a way of life. According to Marxism, art and culture are also not outside the influence of these social forces, and they are also not independent. In fact, art and culture help in the transmission of this ideology, and in maintaining this hegemony in the society, but it does not mean that every art helps in spreading a particular ideology of the ruling class. There are certain examples where art and literature has rejected and protested against the dominant ruling systems. Next, let us understand psychoanalysis or psychoanalytical theory and criticism. The psychoanalysis works on two levels, the conscious and the unconscious. The study of the unconscious part of the human mind is called as the psychoanalytic theory. Sigmund Freud, in his interpretation of dreams, talks about the suppressed wishes and desires that form our dreams. According to him, whenever an individual suppresses his deepest desires from getting fulfilled, they turn into dreams. So basically, dreams are the unfulfilled desires of an individual that lay buried in his subconscious mind. In literature, the psychoanalytic theory tries to understand texts that appear nonsensical and distorted, just like dreams, and find out the hidden meaning into them. According to another critic, Carl Jung, there are many universal symbols like the garden, the desert, fire, water, monster, hero, etc. that are stored in our unconscious mind, but they have a certain hidden meaning to them. The psychoanalytical theory greatly influenced the modern and postmodern literary theories of the 20th century. In his book, Anxiety of Influence, Harold Bloom talks about the desire of the new artists or budding writers, who appear to be influenced by the previous writers, and try to seek inspiration from them. But, according to him, on a deeper level, these new writers also have a subconscious desire to do better than the popular and established writers. He means that it is the primal desire of a poet to do even better, and become even more popular than his predecessor. The psychoanalytical theory also influenced the feminist writers like Helen Sixes, who gave the concept of écriture féminine in her book, The Laugh of Medusa. According to Sixes, the feminist writing is not only a writing which is free from male domination or patriarchy, but it is also a psychological desire to debunk the established patriarchal writing systems, like the use of strict grammar, or writing in a particular genre, or using an established and acceptable narrative structure. According to her, the feminist writing experiments with imagination, and gives way to the voice of the unconscious mind. It tells the story of a woman according to her choice, her story, in her own way, and not how the male-dominated world wants her to write it. Sigmund Freud is popular for his theory of Oedipus complex. According to Freud, in the growing up years or the Oedipal stage, the son has to detach from his mother, because the society demands so, and he has to identify or connect with his father, and enter into this symbolic order, that is the acceptable social order. This detachment from mother leads to a hostility and rivalry between the male child and his father, because he feels that he has been distant or separated from his mother, but the father still continues to be close to her. Therefore, in many cultures, we see that sons do not go well along with their fathers, but they are more comfortable with their mothers when it comes to emotions. The opposite of Oedipus complex is Electra complex, which says that it is the daughters who have a certain hostility and rivalry with their mothers, but they have a certain affection for their fathers. Since both the females want to grab the attention and love of that man. Moving on to the next theory, which is the formalist literary theory, or the early 20th century literary criticism. The formalist literary theory was a departure from the subjective theories of literature, which were based on feelings and emotions, or how the readers respond to a certain text, and in what ways the reality or truth is represented through literary texts. The formalist theory gave rise to two schools of thought, the New Criticism and the Russian Formalism. New critics saw poetry as an independent and autonomous entity, and focused majorly on its form and structure. They believed that the historical and social contexts, and the life of the author, the background that he came from, etc., do not affect the meaning of the text. They believe that whenever one tries to understand a literary text or a poem, one must go for the close reading of poetry, which should be free from any influences that would come from its author, or from his or her background. The Russian formalism, on the other hand, studied a piece of literature, or a poem, by focusing on its literariness. That means, they studied a piece of literature on the basis of the devices and strategies, like its narrative structure, versification, style, etc. The major difference between the two was, where the new critics focused on understanding the text by closely reading it and analyzing it to draw some meaning out of it, the Russian formalists, on the other hand, focused not on the meaning of the text, but on the structure, language, and technique used in writing that text. So both the schools focused on the text itself, but their understanding and analyzing of that text was a little different from each other. Next we have the hermeneutics and the reception theory. First, let us discuss the reception theory. Reception theory, or the reader response theory, believes that the meaning is always there within the text, but that meaning keeps on changing, along with the perceptions, emotions, and the ideas of the readers. So, a literary text might have a very different meaning in today's context for a reader reading as text today, and it might even have a different meaning for a very different reader. Therefore, for them, the meaning is not static, but it is dynamic. It keeps on changing along with the reader, and with the time period when he or she is analyzing that text. Hermeneutics is also a form of reader response theory, but it seeks to discover whether the original meaning that the text had has any relevance for the readers today. It tries to understand what the text is really about, and what does the text actually want to convey. Next comes the structuralist theory. The structuralist theory believes that any literary text does not have an absolute true meaning or any absolute value to it, in isolation. That means, everything has a meaning in context to the other elements. Everything makes sense only in relation to something else. For example, when we say that something is black, then we know that it is not white, or red, or green, or even black. According to structuralists, to understand a particular element, we need to study the whole system of relationship or structures. If we understand this theory in the context of culture, then we can say that, by understanding one part of a culture, we cannot claim to have understood the entire culture. Here comes the role of binary opposites. Binary opposites mean that the meaning is not something absolute, but it depends on binary opposites. That means, we understand something in opposition to something else. For example, there is no meaning of hot unless we understand what is cold, or we do not understand what is good when we have not seen evil, and so on. Next we have the post-structuralist theory, and the deconstruction. Let us first understand what is deconstruction. The deconstruction theory was given by Jacques Derrida in his lecture, Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. According to him, the whole of the Western philosophy, or Western thought process, was centered on the concept of the presence of one God, one ideal form, and the universal truth, which the Western world believed in. And in doing so, the Western world dominated, marginalized, and ignored any kind of differences, be it the religious, social, or economic, that were always present in the rest of the world. For example, a male-dominated society completely marginalizes and ignores the existence of females. So, in a way, one who is in the center, and is powerful, has the liberty to marginalize and ignore the one less powerful. Thus, in literature, the deconstruction literary theory tries to find the binary opposites within a text, and then understand how these binary opposites are related to each other, and one of these binaries, which is in the center, tries to repress and marginalize the opposite other. Then we have the post-structuralist theory. The post-structuralist theory was a movement associated with French critics like Derrida, Julia Kristeva, Roland Barthes, and Michel Foucault, who believe that the truth and the real meaning resides within a structure, or within a text, and in order to understand the meaning, we must understand the structure of the text itself. They did not believe in the universal truth, as they believed that anything which is called a universal truth is again a social construction created by the dominant class. Next comes the feminist literary theory. The basic concept of feminist literary theory is to expose the masculine stereotypes operating in the society. It talks about the marginalization of women in a male-dominated society and even in literatures. Feminist literary theory also focuses on the study of female creativity, literary styles, themes, and literary traditions. It believes that all the women, not only as characters, but also as writers, have long been neglected in history. Feminist theory evaluates the impact of politics, biology, culture, and history in shaping the lives of women and their literature through the centuries. Some of the major feminist critics and their works are A Literature of Their Own by Elaine Showalter. Then we have The Mad Woman in the Attic by Gilbert and Gbar. And Judith Fetterly's The Resisting Reader, a Feminist Approach to American Fiction. Then comes the New Historicism. The New Historicism is a literary theory that focuses on the meaning of a text, which it believes is drawn from the ideology and society of the time when it was produced or written. This theory believes that the literary texts are culturally embedded objects, and therefore, whenever we try to understand a text, we should consider the culture in which the author produced that work, and not just understand the work on the basis of its structure and form. This theory believes that a particular piece of literature is not the product of a single mind, or single author who wrote it, but rather, it is the collective product of that particular time period and ideology during which it was produced. So new historicists believe that culture has everything to do with that literary text. Next comes the cultural studies. Cultural studies can be seen as opposite to the formalist literary theory. It is an interdisciplinary field, which takes into consideration the other fields like sociology, history, anthropology, political science, etc., to understand the meaning hidden in a text. Cultural theory examines a text within the context of its sociocultural environment. Cultural critics believe a text should be read entirely through the lens of its cultural context. It means a text should be understood only after understanding the culture and the time period when it was written. The next theory is queer theory. The queer literary theory criticizes the centrality of the heterosexual world. It criticizes the strict binaries into which the world is divided, that is, either masculine or feminine. Because when we see the world with masculine or feminine traits, then we marginalize any other kind of sexuality, which is not only seen as abnormal, but also dangerous and criminal. Queer theory is not limited to the study of the lesbian and gay theories, but instead, it focuses on the study of every kind of alternative sexualities which might be there in the society. It criticizes the social constructs, rules, conventions, systems, which bind the society into two categories, either male or female, and rejects any other kind of gendered category. So that was all about the basics of the literary theory and criticism, starting from the classical period, and reaching up to the present age. This video is a brief overview of the basic concepts of all the theories and their criticism. In order to understand the literary theory and criticism deeply, you may consult the books by M. R. Habib, Peter Berry or Pramod K. Nair.